Hello, welcome to another edition of At Home with the Roosevelts. I'm Paul Sparrow, the director of the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park. Today's program is something that's been partially sponsored by the National Archives Foundation in celebration of the centennial of the women's suffrage movement, the 19th Amendment. And joining me today is a woman who was truly a pioneer in women's studies, Dr. Sally Wagner. She was one of the first people to get a PhD in women's studies and has led a remarkable 50-year career in really defining and then redefining the field. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Wagner.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thanks.
Now, you're currently a professor at Syracuse, and you have written a number of books. We're going to start with one of your first books because I'm so intrigued with the approach you've taken in trying to incorporate Native women into our narrative about women's rights and women's suffrage. And I think a lot of people are surprised when they find out about this. Now, your first book was called Sisters in Spirit. Do you have a copy of it there? You can show us. What does it look like?
I do. I actually do. It's
a wonderful cover. So talk a little bit about the role of women in Native cultures here in the United States and the impact they had on early American women.
Well, I have to tell you first that this was absolutely an amazing discovery to me. Actually, it was a Native woman scholar who pointed me in the direction, Paula Gunn Allen. And she said that the grandmother's dream was really the basis for the women's movement, and the loss of memory is the foundation of oppression, she said. Well, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was an important suffragist, she was equally important actually with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were the triumvirate of the women's suffrage movement, the National Women's Suffrage Association. And Gage wrote in her major work, Woman, Church, and State, never was justice more perfect, never was civilization higher. And she was talking about the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. And I didn't quite get it. It was, I don't understand this. What was the connection between Native women and non-Native women? And how could there have been any influence? Well, in my sort of, I need to be shown this. I'm highly critical of this. I'm highly skeptical of this. So I really went through about 300 years of contact narratives, of newspapers, of primary sources. And what I know as an outsider, I'm not a Native woman, but what I understand, the best I understand it, is that Haudenosaunee women traditionally are seen as the sacred creators of life, along with Mother Earth. So there's a very strong connection between women and Earth. Women are considered the ones sacred to bring forth life from the soil. So they were the farmers, they were the agriculturalists. They raised corn, beans, and squash, which is ecologically perfect. The corn or the beans set the nitrates in the soil for the corn rises up and the beans twine around, finding sun, and the squash makes a sort of a microclimate, so it keeps the soil in and the weeds out. And eating together, these are nutritionally perfect food. If you eat just the three of them, you can, in combination, you can exist on that indefinitely. So controlling, and that's really a Western way of looking at it, being responsible for the creation of life from Mother Earth also meant that women were really responsible for the economy of the culture. They distributed the food. The husbands were responsible for everything, the men on the earth, the women for everything in the earth. And the men would bring back the hunt and give it to the woman, who would do whatever she wanted to with it. She could give the whole thing away to other people who needed it. But no one ever went hungry. The women were such good agriculturalists that they had 2 to 3 years supply of food in underground caches. They were ultimately responsible for decisions of war and peace. They had the final authority in terms of land. They had their own possessions, everyone did. But it was a collective economy in terms of everybody's needs being met. The women, and this is the kicker when we look at suffrage, the women for 1,000 years, and this is continuing, have had political voice in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, while in 2020 we celebrated 100 years of guaranteed political voice in the Constitution, not in practice, but at least guaranteed in the Constitution. How did this work? It was a balance, not women having more authority or men having more authority, but a balance of authority. The idea was the women raise the children. The women know what young men will be the best to be the voice of the people. The woman, the clan mother, is the eyes and ears of the people. She listens to what the people's needs are, and she tells and instructs the chief, who then takes the action appropriate. He cannot make a decision for himself. There's sort of 3 rules. He can't make a decision that doesn't meet the needs of the 7th generation. Every decision must look that far into the future. You know, if we frack, what is that going to mean for the 7th generation, for example? But the 3 rules are: he cannot have committed a theft. He cannot have committed a murder. If he's a warrior, he has to step down. And because it's a peace confederacy, it's based on peace. The 3rd thing is he cannot have abused a woman or a child. If he does, or if he ever has, he will never be considered to be a chief. How is he chosen? The clan mother. She raises the boys. The women are raising these young men. And she's looking not for the one who puts himself forward, but the one who steps back and looks to see what everybody's needs are, and looks for someone who will be a good family man and who will think about what are the outcomes to the future of any decision he makes, not somebody who's out for himself. So, white settler colonial women, colonialist women, had contact with these Haudenosaunee women. And what did they see? They saw a world the mirror opposite of theirs in, let's say, the beginning to the middle of the 19th century. This is a time when the Blackstone Code had been adopted. Women had no right to their existence legally. Women were considered dead in the law. They couldn't have their own property. When they married, everything became their husband's. Anything they brought into it, they had no right to their children. Husbands could will away, in the state of New York and other states, husbands could will away an unborn child. The mother gives birth, he dies before the child is born. And when the mother gives birth, the child is given to its rightful owner, and she has no legal recourse. Women have no right to their bodies. Husbands have the legal right to rape and beat their wives as long as they did not inflict permanent injury. They could beat them into obedience, because this is based on canon law. Women are to be under the authority of men, according to the Genesis story of Adam and Eve and the woman being responsible for being sin into the world. The punishment is that she is to be under the authority of the man. And that goes all the way, of course, into the New Testament, that women are to be under the authority of man. So canon law becomes the basis for common law, and the Blackstone Code really enforces that. So here, and women, of course, had no political existence. They couldn't sue or be sued. They couldn't sit on a jury. And of course, they couldn't vote. they didn't exist legally. Married women didn't, and no woman existed politically. So when they saw these women who lived in a world the mirror opposite of their own, what they saw was, this is what's possible. And I think that fueled.
Now, when the movement started in the 19th century to try to create some equality around gender, both the abolitionist movement, in an attempt to end slavery and create some equality for Black Americans, but also for the women's movement, as they were coming up through this, they met this terrific resistance from the church, but also obviously from the patriarchy. Talk about that struggle that led in 1848 to the Seneca Falls Convention, and what had happened with these American women, and why were they suddenly deciding that now was the time to try to take action?
Mm-hmm. Well, we actually could look at the colonial period when women did vote in some instances. Voting was based on property ownership. And if you had sufficient amount of property, if you were a woman or a man, you could vote. So when they began to organize, they said, we're not asking for a new right. We're asking for the restitution of a right that our foremothers had. And they also recognized that when the Revolutionary War happened was when the position of women really went down. Abigail Adams, in that famous letter that she writes to John, if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion. What she's saying to John is, look, England recently adopted this Blackstone Code, which makes the position of women even worse. Don't do it. You're throwing off England politically. Throw off the Blackstone Code. Don't adopt it. Well, state by state, they adopted it. And that's when the state constitutions made it illegal for women to vote. It wasn't just that it wasn't customary. It was that you broke the law if you voted. So, of course, that led to the campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience later of the National Woman Suffrage Association, when they said no taxation without representation, and they refused to pay their taxes. And they said, we have the right to vote in a republic based on the consent of the governed. We have never given our consent to the government. We will vote. That will be a legal act. And the lawbreaker is the federal government that is not protecting us in our right to the ballot. So the confluence of the abolition movement, and women actually began to organize female anti-slavery societies in 1832. The first one was actually started by African American women, and it became a national movement by 1837, and they began to develop political voice at that point. They learned how to conduct meetings, how to fundraise, how to petition, one of the few rights available to women. And that gave them the political savvy, so that when Lucretia Mott came to visit her Quaker friends in Waterloo, which is right next to Seneca Falls, she had just come from Cattaraugus, which is a Seneca nation, and she saw these Seneca women, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, these Seneca women who had this extraordinary existence. And she brought that energy to the planning of the Seneca Falls Convention. But I think what had happened was that most of the organizers, all of them but Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were veterans of the female anti-slavery societies. They'd been involved for at least a decade. They knew how to organize, and now it was time to organize for their own rights.
It was a period in which American exceptionalism emerges as a driving force for our expansion into the West, for our suppression of the native peoples, for our sense of a military identity. There was great conflict at this point about the ownership of people. the enslaved people in the South, but also enslaved peoples in the North. There were many enslaved people here in the state of New York and in Massachusetts and all across the country. There were just many more of them in the South. How do you think that those two forces, the idea that you have these women who are attempting to have their rights restored and to become, participatory members of our political system, and at the same time you had this immense backlash against the abolition movement in the South, were those two connected in some way? And did they, as the Civil War, raged across the country, and then we go into Reconstruction, did they help each other or did they fight each other?
Both. The initial was actually helping each other. And I think, the women talked about this themselves. One of the things they said was, one of the suffragists, the early feminists said, the white woman in New York, the woman in New York, no matter how white her skin, has no more right to her children than the slave woman in Georgia. And they also talked about how husbands had the right to physically violate their wives as their property, and that they made a connection with enslavement. And they also pointed out that if a woman left her home and tried to be safe from a violent, potentially lethal situation, her husband could tell the authorities to bring her back. And of course, they made that same connection with runaway enslaved people. So they made the connection. And I think they saw, this is what enslavement is like. But look, we have some of the same elements in our existence. The abolitionists and the women's rights movement in the 1840s and late 40s and 50s, they're inseparable. They held their conventions at the same time, one before the other, so everybody could go to both. And that was true up until the Civil War. When the Civil War began, the suffragists said, and the suffrage is a word that is in some ways a misnomer, because they were working in the 1850s for every issue from equal pay for equal work, when women only made 50%, 30 to 50% of what men made. Today we make 75. There's going to be another 150 years before we get pay equity in the US, if you do the math. But they were working with that issue, job security, job equity. They were looking at a woman's right to her body, to be free of violence, the issues that we still haven't solved today. They had raised by 1850. So the Civil War happens, and the women's rights advocates say, we are just going to work to end slavery. And they formed the Women's National League. I always get those words mixed up. And they gathered the largest number of petitions that had ever been gathered, signatures on petitions in the country to that point. And they gathered petitions saying, we will only support this war effort as long as it's being fought to end slavery. And it was at the time when Lincoln was saying, we're fighting the war to preserve the Union. And they said, no, we will only support this war effort. And of course, they were raising the money to take care of the Sanitary Commission, to take care of the medical care of the soldiers from the North. So they had some economic leverage for what they were doing. But after the Civil War, they held their first convention, and then they said, you know what? Let's join together. Abolitionists, women's rights movement, let's join with the Anti-Slavery Association, and together we will work for universal suffrage. I think Theodore Tilton, one of the activists who is both women's rights and abolitionist, said, the door of freedom has swung open, and it's time for the woman and the Negro to march through it arm in arm. Well, that isn't what happened. The radical Republicans who had control of Congress said, we can't get the whole thing through. We can only give partial suffrage. We'll give it to African American men. And then in the 14th Amendment, which was the enabling legislation, they said, it was like, oh, what are we going to do? We've got to protect the rights of citizens now that we've freed slaves, and we have to remove slavery from the Constitution, where of course it was in place with the 3/5 of a person is what Negro enslaved people were considered for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. So, of course, the South had control of Congress because they had this unequal representation with all of their enslaved property being considered as 3/5 of a person. So, 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished. 14th Amendment, we're going to protect the rights of citizens, these newly freed enslaved people are now citizens. We need to protect them. But how are we going to just protect the men? Because we're only going to give them the vote. So they wrote for the first time into the Constitution gender. They 3 times in the 14th Amendment, citizens are defined as males. Male citizen, male citizen, male citizen. And so women were written out of the Constitution at that point. And there was a huge battle over this. And it didn't even come down women and African Americans on different sides. Different people held different positions. And Charles Purvis, for one, said, or I guess it was Robert Purvis, said, I have a son and a daughter. I would rather that my son wait for 50 years to get the vote because my daughter, as a Negro and as a woman, is doubly in need of the protection of the ballot. While his son Charles supported the 14th and 15th Amendments. So, it divided people. It was a horrendous moment. And that's the moment when historians have really pointed out the racism of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They took money from a white supremacist for their newspaper, The Revolution, and it reflected some of his views, as did they.
So if we jump ahead now about 50 years, the turn of the century, you're in the early 1900s, and essentially a new generation of women have emerged to carry the banner forward. And you get the National Women's Party, and you get this movement that really decides that they need to make their voices heard in new ways. And you get these incredible marches in Washington, D.C., and women picketing outside the White House. Talk about that generation of women's suffrage and what they were subjected to, and the incredible bravery and persistence that they showed in confronting, what was at that point, a really antiquated legal and political system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really tough period. What happened was that there were 2 organizations that formed after that split. It actually became a split with the 14th and 15th Amendment, the American and the National. National was more progressive. They did the campaign of nonviolence, civil disobedience. The American, for example, they wrote a Declaration of Rights of Women, and they said we have greater cause for discontent, rebellion, and revolution than did the fathers of 1776. They were ruled by a foreign despot. We are ruled by our brothers, our fathers, our husbands, and our sons. They made an illegal presentation at the official July 4th celebration of their Declaration of Rights of Women, and they impeached the government for its treatment of women. That was the National Women's Suffrage Association. The same day, July 4th, 1876, the American Women's Suffrage Association celebrated with a tea party. So you get a sense of the difference between the 2 groups. Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone, competing leaders, really wanted just to work for the vote. And so they combined the 2 organizations to just work for suffrage. Drop the other issues, let's just go for suffrage. That became the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and it practiced states' rights. It allowed the states to do whatever they really wanted to do. They also worked state by state to get the vote rather than for a federal amendment. In some ways, that was a racist strategy, because if states can give women the vote, can't they take it away from African American men? And that actually became policy. They said, give women the vote because white women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, and women's suffrage is a way to maintain white native-born supremacy. That was the National American. The Women's Party emerged out of that organization as the Congressional Union and then the Women's Party. And they're the ones who kicked ass. They chained themselves to the White House. They did these huge mammoth parades. They did an automobile trip all the way across the country, from California to the steps of the Capitol, bringing thousands and thousands of names on petitions for the vote. They had great theatrics, and they also had enormous courage. They were force-fed when they were in prison. They were imprisoned for their civil disobedience, and they burned the president in effigy, and they were imprisoned for their protests at the White House. So they are force-fed when they go on a hunger strike. What they endured is amazing. So yes, tremendous courage. But it's a mixed history here, because we have the National American Women's Suffrage Association finally coming on board, joining the Women's Party in working for a federal amendment. But what they decide is we've got to court the South. So what we'd have to do is court Southern racists. And they gave the state auxiliaries the right to do whatever they wanted. And some of them segregated, some of them worked for the vote for white women only, and some of them worked for Jim Crow laws. So the voter suppression laws that the South was really putting in place, some of the suffragists supported that work to create voter suppression. Things to celebrate and things to really learn from. If you throw one group under the bus in order to get your rights, you may win the battle, but you lose the war for freedom. And I think for me, that's the final lesson of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They fought hard, they fought long, but they fought wrong.
Now, during this period, immediately prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment, Eleanor Roosevelt, who later on becomes quite a champion of women's equality, was living in Washington. She was married to Franklin Roosevelt, who was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Wilson, who was a pretty openly avowed racist. And she saw this going on. And Eleanor, she was raising small children, but she was much more involved in the sort of social support she had to give for her husband as a rising political figure. And she really didn't support women's suffrage. I mean, when her husband came out in favor of it, she sort of decided that I guess I have to support this as well. But she certainly wasn't a champion during that period. But then in the 1920s, things really begin to change as she becomes very involved in the labor movement and sees the inequities that women are experiencing, particularly immigrant women, but also American women. And she really starts to develop this reputation as the great champion of women. Was that common in a transition for women from pre-19th Amendment to post-19th Amendment?
Wow, that's fascinating information. I didn't realize that. Thank you for sharing that and enlightening me. And that question is one I'm really going to need to think about that. The 1920s become the flapper era, they become the individual freedom era. And much of the, I think the intergenerational knowledge broke down which is another one of the lessons I think we need to learn, is that there's a value of learning your own history of a movement and to build on that. And I think one of the things that happened was that was lost. But I'm really going to chew on your question because I'm not able to answer it at this point. The best question is when you can't answer, because then you get a chance to do more research. So thank you for that.
Now, one of your other books, the Women's Suffrage Movement, which is sort of an anthology. Could you hold it up? I think you showed it earlier. So what time frame, when you look at that arc of the movement, where does that movement go? Does it go to the 1920s, the 1960s, the 2000s? Is it still going on?
Well, it begins 1,000 years ago with Haudenosaunee women, and it ends. When does it end? It ends with the unfinished business. You know, African American women, although they organized separately, some of them organized within the women's movement, were repopulating women's suffrage history finally, and there's extraordinary work being done. We're queering women's suffrage. We're celebrating the women of color, the Black, Indigenous people of color who are part of the movement. So we're really looking at the story in its correct framework, a much larger framework. And that tells a different story. African American women, they organized separately for other issues. The women's suffrage movement wouldn't deal with the issue of lynching, which the ultimate form of voter suppression. And the African American women's organizations did. They worked for suffrage. They even made coalitions with the racist white women's movement, which is, it's an extraordinary story of seeing the bigger picture and being willing to work in that collaborative way. But African American women and men in practice didn't get the vote until the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. Native American women, the ones that wanted to vote, not all Native Americans vote. The traditional Haudenosaunee maintain their absolute sovereignty, and they don't accept dual citizenship in the United States and their own sovereign nations, as many of the Native nations do. But those who wanted to vote didn't get it guaranteed until 1923 and the Indian Rights Act. Asian women and men, not until the 20th century. So I think the book has maybe a beginning 1,000 years ago, but it has no end, because the voter suppression that keeps us from having a democracy, of course, as we know, continues today. And in fact, there's more attempt right now to suppress it in some of the states than there has been since the Civil War. So we are facing the same issue again.
All right, so we're running out of time, and I want to ask you one final question, which is about the future, because as we all know, future is in the hands of the children of today. And how do you talk to them about this? I know you have a new book out that's targeting high school kids, the students today. This generation certainly have a much more open attitude. They're much more accepting. They're much more diverse. Talk about this new book that you have and how you try to engage a younger generation in this conversation.
The book is called We Want Equal Rights, and it's subtitled How Suffragists Were Influenced by Haudenosaunee Women. And it's really a book that is more geared toward young people. And I did it because the publisher kept finding that there was a hunger for that kind of a book for telling this story. And I think there is that hunger. There's a hunger for truth in history. History isn't what happened, it's who tells the story. And I think that as you're telling a different story about Eleanor Roosevelt, we really are expanding the story that we tell, and we're telling it from different perspectives. We're expanding it from the dominant narrative into what was going on with everybody at this time and what was their part in it. And I have tremendous hope. I'll tell you, I'm the director of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation in Fayetteville, New York. We have a program, the Gage Ambassadors for Human Rights, and those young women became so interested in this story that they just created a guide, a study guide for the book on their own, which is brilliant. It's a wonderful, I couldn't have come up with anything this good. But I think it indicates the kind of hunger that young people have for, tell me the real story, tell me the fullness of it. Don't give me the old dominant narrative of rich white men and their wars and their dates. So I join with you in the exciting work to create a larger story.
Dr. Wagner, thank you so much for joining us today. It really is amazing. I learned so much, and it's so important that we do open our minds to what history is and who is included in that history. That's something, obviously, a presidential library, we always try to go back to the original documents. One of the great assets we have are all the letters that were written to Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt when they were in the White House. And those are the voices of the real people, and they tell a real story. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And that's it for today's At Home with the Roosevelts. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I do. I hope we see you again here sometime in the near future. Thank you for joining us.